single gene disorders, which are so common in the central nervous system, at 18 weeks of gestation, 19 weeks, not at 27, 28 weeks of gestation. So if you ask me, you say, Simon, what are the abnormalities that you can pick up in the first trimester of pregnancy? And if you pick up any standard textbook, you will see a huge list of brain abnormalities. And these will never be detected in the first trimester of pregnancy, but they are all extremely rare. These conditions, however, are far more common. In fact, they represent 2/3 of central nervous system malformations, and these can be detected in the first trimester of pregnancy. I'll repeat that. 2/3 of brain malformations can be detected in the first trimester of pregnancy. So we need to treat it seriously as to how we go about examining the brain. There are two ways. You can either do a basic assessment, which is laid out in the ISIO guideline, but today we're going to be talking about a more detailed assessment of the brain, in which you examine the brain in both axial and in sagittal sections. And I want to walk through that today. In the sagittal section of the brain, we measure this structure here, which is the brainstem, which appears hypoechoic, the intracranial translucency, and the cisterna magna. You need to see these 3 black spaces for every examination that you do at 11 to 14 weeks of gestation. In 2023, we published a recommendation of examining the brain in 4 sections and producing what we call the 4 quad for every examination that you do. Showing the midline falx, the choroids occupying more than 50%, fluid inside the lateral ventricles, and the calvarium bone present in all babies. The cavum velar interposum in the 2nd section, the aqueduct of Sylvius, and the cerebral 4th ventricle. And in all of these sections you see the cranial bone. And in all of these sections you see the midline falx. If you, for every pregnancy that you scan on Monday morning, and you do a 4-quadrant evaluation of the brain, and you do a sagittal section of the brain showing those 3 blank spaces, there are additional measurements which I'll come to, this will allow you to detect the majority of major brain malformations in the first trimester of pregnancy. Coronal evaluation, which is the 3rd orthogonal plane, is of least value, and I don't recommend that in routine imaging because the yield and return of that is low, but more importantly, it's much more challenging to obtain. So if we go through what abnormalities you can detect by going through those sections, acrania is top of the list. It's a continuum from acrania to exencephaly, and when you get to 20 weeks, there's no brain tissue, it's anencephaly. This is a very detectable abnormality in the first trimester of pregnancy, but it is highly variable in how it appears. To the inexperienced eye, it can be easily missed because you're concentrating on measuring the nuclear translucency. We reported on this back in 2018, the varied appearances of acrania. And this, in a sense, is an expression of how it evolves over a pregnancy, evolves over time in the first trimester. You may have the bilobular brain, the foreshortened brain, the elongated brain, the cystic brain, which I don't think is failure of closure of the neural tube. I actually think that's probably a vascular event. The overhanging brain that mimics an encephalocele, and the most common type, the irregular brain. These are all, depending where you scan across 11, 12, and 13 weeks, of the varied appearances of acrania in the first trimester of pregnancy. And then we reported on the Turkish turban sign, which is acrania, which really is regular amniotic bands. When you identify acrania, don't pack your bags and go home. It's important that you examine the rest of the brain and the rest of the fetus. You say to me, Simon, what do you mean the rest of the brain? There's not much there. You can see in a significant proportion of these pregnancies, if you look at them, that there is dilatation of the cerebral 4th ventricle. Any time where I see that there's dilatation of the cerebral fourth ventricle, I ask myself the question, this is probably a cranial related to chromosome abnormality. I will come to that in a second. Why is that important? Because many patients choose not to continue the pregnancy. And doing a post-abortal karyotype is important. Because if you explain to the patient that it's a cranial related to trisomy 13 or trisomy 18, the chances of recurrence are much lower when compared to a crania where there's no aneuploidy. They have a 5% risk of recurrence in subsequent pregnancies, and the importance of folic acid, as John made, is extremely important in this group. With regard to a crania, as Ritsuko had reference to earlier on, it's a diagnosis we can make early in pregnancy. And how do we make the diagnosis? Because we recognize at 7 weeks of gestation the cranial end of the embryo is much larger when compared to the rump end of the embryo. You can recognize that on a 2D image. You can also recognize that on a 3D reconstructed image. And you can recognize the rump end by identifying the vitelline duct and when the cord inserts. That's important because in some pregnancies it's hard to identify. So the sonographer who did this examination at 7 weeks of gestation recognized the gestation sac and recognized that the cranial end of the embryo was abnormal in shape. And then she recognizes was that the vesicles in the brain, which Ritsuko so beautifully demonstrated, are abnormal. And you will recognize that image because it appeared in the front journal in November of last year as a marker for acrania. And it's not just the one case that we present in the journal. I want to share with you several cases of acrania, all recognized by the sonographers who routinely understood that the cranial end of the embryo should be larger. Not only just larger, but they recognized the shape. And it's from that step of recognizing in all these cases that you then step to looking at a 3D evaluation of the embryos to interpret what your 2D findings are. From 7 weeks to 8 weeks, it becomes a little bit easier because the amniotic fluid becomes hyperechoic, shedding of the brain tissue into the amniotic space. And you can also recognize a craniorachis in this fetus at 8 weeks and 6 days, and in this fetus at 8 weeks and 4 days. In this paper, which we published back in 2020, the appearances of acrania starting from 7 weeks up to 10 weeks of gestation. And you can see the varied appearances of acrania during this gestation, just as I showed you the variations of acrania between 11 to 14 weeks of gestation. So there's a wide variation from very early in the pregnancy as degradation of the brain occurs. I mentioned and made reference to the cystic acrania, which I think is a vascular event or related to amniotic band when you get the Turkish turbans on. You can also see these forms of acrania early in the first trimester of pregnancy. Now we get to 10 weeks of gestation. 10 weeks of gestation is the time we draw blood for cell-free DNA. And this is the gestation in which you can arrive at a certain diagnosis. You say, why, Simon, certain? Because the cranial bone should be present at 10 weeks of gestation. But for anything before 10 weeks of gestation, I do not recommend that a single person in this room goes out into clinical practice tomorrow and starts making diagnosis of acrania before 10 weeks of gestation. I simply share with you an experience of imaging for 15 years since we introduced cell-free DNA. Now we recognize it after 15 years of experience. But to arrive at a certain diagnosis in which you're going to act on, I would recommend not doing that before 10 weeks of gestation. In all of these cases, once you get to 10 weeks of gestation, you see not only an absence of the cranial bone, but you see the many other features which I've already described of acrania. And remember, once you see one abnormality in medicine, in prenatal imaging, then go looking for another. This is the fetus with acrania, but also it has got cardiac extremy at 7 weeks of gestation. And in this case here, when you look at this case with acrania, you can see one limb bud is missing here and the other limb bud is present. This is the fetus with acrania, which you can recognize the abnormal shape of the embryo, but there's also a transverse limb defect at 7 weeks of gestation. So the rule of thumb is once you see one abnormality, then go looking for another. With respect to cephalocele, which John made reference to in his talk, is the next most common we see after acrania. This is the largest world series of 35 cases across 4 fetal medicine centres driven by my friend and colleague Pablo and our unit from Melbourne. And we've reported that 77% of these are occipital. What is an important group is this group when you see in the setting of amniotic band syndrome that these tend to be parietal. And remember, in terms of seeing a cephalocele, the association with Meckler-Gruber syndrome. If you look at cephaloceles, they are a complex problem, and John has reference to this in his talk. There's the cephaloceles, which are associated with trisomy 13 and 18, which is most. There's the single gene disorders, monogenic disorders of Meckler-Gruber, the disruptive symptoms of amniotic band, and then these are the two most challenging groups, the groups that progress and the groups that regress. It is not straightforward, as written in the textbooks, in making an antenatal diagnosis. You need to exert caution because they vary during pregnancy. I think everybody who goes to work tomorrow morning will recognize that the profile is abnormal. There's sloping of the forehead, and you will see a defect in the occipital bone with the aqueduct of Sylvius and midbrain sitting outside the skull. But when you go to a vaginal examination, it's even more obvious because you can see a large cephalocele. This is just an encephalocele, I say. Just. In that there was no associated problems or any of their syndromes I referenced to. You can move to 3D evaluation, and this will give you more detail, and the patient will understand that image. But I don't use 3D to make a diagnosis. It's a diagnosis that's made on 2D evaluation. In this patient, when you go to work tomorrow morning, you're looking at the baby's nuchal translucency, and you see a thin nuchal translucency. You're happy, you measure the crown rope length, you pack your bags, and you go home. You've made a mistake because you have not done a 4-quadrant analysis of the brain. And you have not done your measuring your 3 black spaces. Because your 3 black spaces are abnormal and not seen in this case. And this fetus has got an encephalocele that is so easy to miss unless you do a 4-segment analysis. And then when you go to move to looking at the kidneys, you can see on the kidneys that there's cystic change within the fetal kidneys, and then you go looking at the feet and you appreciate the fetus has got polydactyly. And when you look at the single gene mutation, you get an MSK1, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, and then more recently other single gene mutations that have been described. So now you're moving into the era of offering this patient chorion biopsy, fish analysis, chromosomal microarray, and single gene disorder. This is an encephalocele with a syndrome, a very different picture to the straightforward one I showed you first. The next case, you go to work and you see a very obvious herniation through the occipital bone, and you make a diagnosis. You see a dry brain with the aqueduct of Sylvius, 4th ventricle sitting outside the occipital bone. You say, okay, you pack your bags, you go home. But you've made a mistake because you have not increased the gain. A very simple tool. Every encephalocele you see, increase the gain, and then you will appreciate that there are bands, amniotic bands, extending to the fetal head. And any time you see any abnormality in the situation that associated with amniotic band, digital abnormality, omphaloceles, encephaloceles, acraniates, increase your gain to identify your amniotic band syndrome. In this case, you see there's no fluid inside the lateral ventricles. The choroids look large. Choroids are normal. There's no fluid in the lateral ventricle. And when you then turn to a sagittal section, your 3 black spaces are not present. Your 4 sectional analyses are normal, your 3 black spaces are normal, and the fetal head is hyperextended related to amniotic band syndrome. Appreciated because you increased your gain and recognized that there were multiple bands extending to the fetal head. So what is the natural history of the straightforward encephalocele that we see and are not part of trisomy 18 or 13 or amniotic band? Well, some of them progress and some of them regress. And am I able to tell which progress and regress? No, I can't. Well, not today. We published this in JOHN, in Journal of Ultrasound Medicine, back when the fetus was saw 10 weeks of gestation. I could see that there was a defect in the occipital bone. I could see the aqueduct of Sylvius was exteriorized, and I could see the meninges were exteriorized. I, at that stage, was pretty confident that this was a case of an encephalocele at 10 weeks of gestation at a pre-NIPT scan. When I saw something like that, I could have jumped straight into a discussion about an encephalocele and how serious an abnormality it is. I'm going to jump in the interest of time and show you the MRI, because at 18 weeks of gestation, the posterior cranial fossa is completely normal. The only thing which I can see is when I look at the straight sinus and the connection of the straight sinus to a tiny meningocele. But the posterior cranial fossa, the midbrain and the brainstem were completely normal at 18 to 20 weeks of gestation. And on the grounds of that, the patient continued for pregnancy and to date has a normal outcome. What the long-term outcome is, again, I don't know. I also know that I'm faced with this situation similarly, in which I see what looks like an meningocele. Look at the brain landmarks. Brainstem, the intracranial translucency, and the cisterna magna are all completely normal. When I see the patient 2 weeks later, 2/3 of the brain herniated through the occipital bone. So I'll show you one example of regression and one example of progression. So you need to be very careful in first semester diagnosis of encephalocele as to what direction they may go. In this case, when I saw what looked like an encephalocele with brain herniation through the occipital bone, all the landmarks and axial imaging were normal. You can see a normal aqueduct of Sylvius, a normal fourth ventricle, a normal choroid bar, a normal cerebellum. As far as I was concerned at this stage, I was looking at an epidermoid cyst, a very important differential diagnosis. But while the posterior cranial fossa looked okay, the second trimester, I was concerned about the discordance in the sizes of the cerebellar hemispheres. I thought one side was undersized in the cerebellar hemisphere, and then there was obvious ventriculomegaly. So a case that progressed, but in a very different fashion, well beyond the posterior fossa into other additional abnormalities. And then there's this case which looked almost identical in another example with a normal aqueduct of Sylvius, normal fourth ventricle, the rest of brain entirely normal, and looking at the same patient at 16 weeks of gestation. When I come down from lateral ventricles to choroids, everything was completely normal, and then I come down to the posterior cranial fossa. I see a normal cerebellum, normal fourth ventricle, normal cisterna magna in a baby that has an epidermoid cyst. You see how challenging it is. So you need to exert caution in first trimester diagnosis in these cases. For the obvious, just straightforward encephalocele, for many of these, we can make these calls much earlier in the pregnancy. This is at 13 weeks of gestation, this is at 9 weeks of gestation. And when you look at these in the rendered image of these, you can identify these acranias on the rendered image, and you can recognize that not only is there acrania, but there is also anterior abdominal wall defect in this fetus very, very early in the pregnancy. Meningoceles, we can see these very early in the pregnancy in first trimester. Be careful not to confuse these with yolk sacs, because they can be juxtaposed to the occipital bone, but yolk sacs are outside the amniotic sac. This is inside the amniotic sac, attached to the fetal head, But look at the brainstem, the intracranial translucency, the cisterna magna, they are entirely normal in the fetus with the meningitis. But I'm very cautious about counselling this patient that this is not going to evolve into an encephalocele. And don't be caught by this. This is not an encephalocele. This is outside the amniotic sac. Whereas look at this one, looks like a yolk sac, but when you push on the fetal head, it moves with the fetal head. This is inside the amniotic sac. This is a fetus with a meningocele. And then there's the holoprosencephaly. For me, this is the easiest diagnosis of all of these to make in the first semester of pregnancy, because there are 3 sonographic markers. Absence of the falx, sharing of the choroids across the midline, and a single anterior monoventricle. And the same principle applies all the way back to 8 weeks of gestation. A terrible condition, because 50% of these die within the first 4 months of life. And for those that we can pick up prenatally, in the first trimester, is the alobar and semilobar. We cannot identify lobar. We first reported on this condition, again, across the 4 same centres of us and Monash and Uvaldo, and recognized across the 4 centres of 45 cases of first trimester holoprosencephaly. We recognized that there was a reduction in the BPD. John made reference to this, the importance in spina bifida detection, but it's also important in cephaloceles and holoprosencephaly, all these 3 abnormalities. But in a sense, you don't have to rely so much, maybe at the very junior stage of BPD, but really the other findings are so striking because you recognize when you look at this multiplanar analysis, you can see all those features I said to you. Sharing the choroids across the midline, single anterior monoventricle, and absence of the falx. An irrefutable diagnosis at this stage of pregnancy. You may use 3D render to look inside the brain and see the sharing of the choroids across the midline, but it's a 2D diagnosis. When you go to do your 4-quadrant analysis of this brain, the first section is abnormal, sharing of the choroids across the midline. The second section is abnormal with interruption of the falx. The third section is normal, the 4th section is normal. All 4 sections in a quad are normal because the falx is absent in all cases. The cerebral 4th ventricle is not dilated, it's normal. And therefore I'm thinking it's unlikely to be aneuploid because of the power of the 4th ventricle in the first semester. And if you're looking for hypotelorism, do not look on coronal imaging. If you want to make a call of hypotelorism, you need to have axial imaging. These 2 orbits are juxtaposed, but they don't look juxtaposed when you look at coronal imaging. Anytime, at any stage of gestation, you need to have axial imaging in making a call. We reported this case in the American Journal of ONG of making a call of holoprosencephaly at 9 weeks of gestation by using 3D technologies. And when you look at 3D technology, you see this embryo at 9 weeks and 2 days of gestation. It looks completely normal on a surface rendered image. But when you look at the 4th ventricle, it's grossly dilated, the rhombencephalon. You see there's a central facial cleft lip, cleft palate, and you see a single anterior monoventricle, absence of the choroids and sharing across the midline. An irrefutable diagnosis at 9 weeks of gestation because it has all the 3 criteria. It's much more straightforward than making a call of a cranium or a cephaloceles. And a digital inversion cast showing a single anterior monoventricle and dilated 4th ventricle on the right-hand side. You can use the more recent HDLI renders silhouette, again demonstrating both of these cases a single anterior monoventricle sharing of the choroids across the midline. Again, I make the point though, the diagnosis is made on 2D evaluation. In this case, we tried voiding the small abdominal circumference. And look at this with a 12 megahertz transducer. This looks like a 13-week pregnancy almost with the resolution that you're getting. But you see that big 3rd ventricle and aqueduct, which is a feature of the 10-week scans. But this is a case with a crown length of 28 and 9 weeks and 4 days. A near refutable diagnosis with all the markers are there on the scan. We've recently recognized and soon to put to print that in the cases of holoprosencephaly in the first trimester,
the anterior communicating artery is absent. So when you look at this case and you run through on a stick volume analysis, you can see the circle of Willis. And when you look at the anterior communicating artery, it is not visible at 9 weeks and 6 days. We've now started to look at this across in our later pregnancies, and in all of our cases so far of holoprosencephaly, the anterior communicating artery is absent. And you will see this in print hopefully shortly. Semilobar holoprosencephaly is a much more challenging diagnosis, a reduction in the frontal maxillary facial angle, and you can see only on the first section of the quad when you see sharing of the anterior horns across the midline. A much more challenging diagnosis because the other sections of the brain are normal. With regard to the cerebral fourth ventricle, as you look at this on a 4-quadrant evaluation, I ask you to tell me which of these is abnormal. When you come to the fourth quadrant on the right-hand side, you will see the fourth ventricle demonstrated and compare to the fourth section on the left-hand side. This is a case with a dilated fourth ventricle. This is a case with a normal fourth ventricle. In evaluating the fourth ventricle in the first trimester of pregnancy, it may be dilated. In the setting of seeing another abnormality, the hypoplastic left heart, the problem is trisomy 18. 53% of trisomy 18 represent the dilated fourth ventricle. In this case, you see bilateral pleural effusions, tachycardia, short femur, and a dilated cerebral fourth ventricle. 80% of trisomy 18 represent the dilated fourth ventricle. In this case, you see a sagittal image of a dilated fourth ventricle with a cystic hygroma in a fetus with monosomy X with a dilated fourth ventricle. In this case, you will see a small abdominal circumference, you think it's macrocephaly, in a fetus with digynic tripody. 83% of digynic tripody represent the dilated fourth ventricle. In fact, it's a very important marker to see because in fetuses with a dilated fourth ventricle who have cell-free DNA, if you don't use a SNP-based platform, it'll be low risk. And therefore you're relying on your ultrasound. And according to one of the largest series of triploidy from Israel, over 95% of digynic triploidy will present with a dilated fourth ventricle. It is a very important marker. When the chromosomes come back normal in this fetus at 12 weeks, the anatomy at 20 weeks showed a plate pouch cyst, which fenestrated at 31 weeks of gestation. This is very different to this case, where you have the fourth ventricle here which is dilated, here you have a baby with Danby-Walker malformation, and here you have elevation of the tentorium. So how can you tell at 12 weeks whether it's going to be Danby-Walker or whether it's going to be a plate pouch? Well, it's very straightforward. Because all you have to do is look at the aqueduct of Sylvius. And in this case, the aqueduct of Sylvius is dilated. In this case, which turned out to be a Danby-Walker, the aqueduct of Sylvius is absent. Really, Simon? Is it that straightforward? Is it diagnostic? That's based on a publication in the White Journal of 4 cases. You can't make a call on that going forward in the future, but it is something that we need to look at as we move forward in screening in those babies who present with the fourth ventricle with normal chromosomes by looking at the aqueduct of Sylvius. A beautiful paper by Ritsuko on Joubert syndrome, looking at the lambda sign, where the rhombic lips are separated in the communication of the aqueduct with the fourth ventricle. And this can be so easily demonstrated using the 3D with VCR in 2 cases of Joubert, and on the axial section you can see that molar tooth sign with the dilated cerebral fourth ventricle. And in others you can see dilatation of the fourth ventricle, dilatation of the aqueduct, in fact dilatation of all of the ventricles. Panventriculomegaly, which chorion biopsy was normal, chromosome microarray was normal, and exome sequencing was normal. We did not find an answer for what was the reason for why this baby would present with panventriculomegaly. But it is so gross at this late stage of gestation that we deem that the prognosis is extremely poor for this pregnancy. Beware that in some fetuses with dilatation of the fourth ventricle, that it may be transient. And that's a very important group to acknowledge. They're small in numbers, but they do exist. And 13-week dilated fourth ventricle by 16 weeks is returned completely to normal. I'll skip very quickly through spina bifida because John has covered this. 30% of spina bifida would be identified on direct imaging of the spine. We all know in the mid-trimester you can identify spina bifida by looking at a lemon-shaped head and a banana-shaped cerebellum. In the first trimester, that's exactly what we did. But we wasted 10 years looking at the posterior cranial fossa. The answer is not in the posterior cranial fossa. The intercranial translucency is not a powerful marker of spina bifida. The very first paper which reported on an absence of the intercranial translucency was 100% of cases. We now recognize that the intercranial translucency is present in 80% of babies with spina bifida. Only 20% is in fact absent. The answer is not in the posterior cranial fossa. The answer is in the midbrain. It's very different to the second trimester pregnancy. We wasted 10 years until we recognized that it was displacement of the midbrain. And this was recognized on both axial imaging and on sagittal imaging by looking at the brainstem or occipital bone diameter. Both of those papers were published in the exact same journal in the exact same month. And when you look at it, what happens in spina bifida is that your brainstem descends and the distance between the brainstem and the occipital bone is reduced. And in 80% of them, the fourth ventricle, or intracranial translucency, is still visible and present. So when you look at that axial section, for me personally, I think this is the most powerful marker. Because in training, everybody knows how to do BPD. Not everybody knows how to look at the 6 lines of the 3 black spaces and measure tiny distances and shifts and refer to a reference chart. Or what cutoff do you use for each week of gestation? But everybody knows what a BPD looks like. And when you do your BPD, you recognize that that's a normal BPD and that's a normal aqueduct. But that's what spina bifida looks like. It gets shifted posteriorly and sits juxtaposed to the occipital bone. It is so easy to screen for spina bifida by doing that. We quantify the distance between the aqueduct of Sylvius and the occipital bone across 650 pregnancies. And if you want a quick cutoff mark of 2.5 millimeters, if it measures less than that, you need to look at the spine. 8 years later, Fred Ushakov published the White Journal of the Crash Sign, which in my personal view was plagiarism. It was a complete replication of the paper which we had published 8 years earlier. Not only did we publish the shift of the midbrain and brainstem, we quantified it by objective measurement of the aqueduct to the occipital bone measurement. I had drinks with Fred and we're good mates. And he simply said to me, Simon, I didn't see your paper. That's okay. But I think the reviewers maybe should have seen the paper. So if I show you this case on the left-hand side, and I ask you which of these babies have got spina bifida, who in the audience can tell me which baby's got spina bifida? The left one or the right one? Well, you all recognize on the right-hand side the shift of the midbrain and the brainstem. It's very easy to see because you all know it in the BPD. But if you look at the left-hand side, you can see the fourth ventricle intracranial translucency is normal. But do you honestly, on a subjective image, recognize that the brainstem to the occipital bone distance is reduced? No, you don't. Not subjectively, you don't. You have to take out your caliper and measure it. You might recognize subjectively that the brainstem is enlarged. These two images are from the same baby. And that's why I make the point that axial imaging of the brain is more valuable. All of these babies in this image have got spina bifida. And I ask you, as you look at all of these cases, you'll see all of them have got an intercranial translucency. But it's small, but they have an intercranial translucency. Do you think you'd recognize those if you went to work tomorrow morning? Do you see how difficult it is? In the hands of the experts, they're very good at picking up spina bifida. In the hands of the screening population, it is much more challenging. Let me show you, as you look at these cases here, 24 cases of spina bifida And in every single one of these, the sonographer picked them up because she recognized by taking a BPD, which we do routinely for every pregnancy, that the occipital bone, the aqueductal occipital bone distance was reduced and that there was midbrain shift in every single one of these pregnancies. That's the first 12, and this is the next 12. And as you look at every single one of these, it is so striking subjectively when you look at midbrain to brainstem shift that I believe if you do that every day is your third section in your forequad, everyone in this room will improve their detection rate of spinal bifida going forward in the future. So I finish up my talk and make one very quick comment about ventricular negative, because Sukla has covered this so beautifully in her talk, is we do not measure the lateral ventricle in assessing for ventricular negative in the first trimester. We look at measuring the area of the choroids to the area of the lateral ventricles, and we look at calculating the ratio between the two of them. But I have to be honest with you, that for the majority of babies where we make a diagnosis of ventricular negative first trimester, it's on subjective assessment. We then go to objective. We do not routinely measure the lateral ventricles in the first trimester pregnancy because the atria serve no purpose, as Suko had mentioned. It's when we see a baby that looks like this with dilated lateral ventricles on a 2D image and on a surface rendered image. Because the choroids should occupy more than 50%. These choroids occupy less than 50% of the lateral ventricles in a baby with aqueductal stenosis. In this baby here, where you see a hydrothorax, you see the choroids occupy less than 50%, the fetus with trisomy 21. And in this case here, you can see choroids occupy less than 50% with a cord plexus cyst or possibly ganglionic eminence cyst in the baby with agenesis of the corpus callosum. But the diagnosis of agenesis corpus callosum was not made at 13 weeks. It was made in the mid-trimester. Because you cannot make a diagnosis of agenesis of the corpus callosum before 13 weeks and 6 days, or between 11 weeks and 13 weeks and 6 days of gestation. And lastly, cord plexus cysts. Don't stress out about them because they are a benign variant in the vast majority of cases. In most babies, we have NIPT when we see these, and we know that the risk of trisomy 18 is low. But just make sure there are no markers of trisomy 18 and 13. But most of these are a benign variant, and they can look like brain tumors in the first trimester. Be very cautious when you see these because they are a benign variant. So in summary, when you go to work tomorrow morning, remember that for 2/3 of major brain malformations can be identified in the first trimester. And I ask you just to do one thing. Do a full quadrant analysis for every patient that you see in the first trimester of pregnancy. Move to a sagittal assessment of the brain. Look for the 3 blank spaces of the brainstem. Look at the intracranial translucency, and then look at the cisterna magna. I encourage you to measure the intracranial translucency, not as a marker for spina bifida, but rather as a marker when it's dilated in the setting of all the abnormalities which I've outlined. And if you want to screen for spina bifida by taking a measurement, don't take a measurement of the intracranial translucency, take a measurement from the brainstem to the occipital bone. Thanks very much for your attention.